Yo, what's going on YouTube? It's your man Soul. Welcome back. I am back. I know it's been a long time since I've put out a video. A lot of things have transpired IRL, but none of that matters right now. All that matters is that my focus is back on YouTube, and I'm here to try to provide some more compelling and good content for you guys. So here we have the Kata raid comp tool. Now, a while back I did the Wrath raid comp tool, and that was more so for building the correct comp. And in this video, I'm not going to focus so much on building a raid comp, but maybe I'll do that in a later video. This video really is just talking about the changes to the raid buffs and the sources for those buffs coming in Cataclysm, if we get a Cataclysm Classic, which we probably will. So without further ado, let's jump on in. Alright, let's start at the top of the list here in raid buffs, starting with the stats buff, also known as Kings. And as you can see here, it's provided by Blessing of Kings, Mark of the Wild, and Embrace of the Shell Spider. And first I want to start with the nerf that they did to the stats buff, going from 10% to 5%. And I think they did that because they may have felt like, or maybe one of the reasons they did that was in endgame Kata gear, with it being such a substantial increase from in-game Wrath gear, a 10% increase from above might have been too substantial. So to reduce that down a little bit kind of evens it out. I don't know, that's just my working theory. I don't know for sure, but that's kind of what I feel like. But in terms of the buff itself, I think this is a welcome change. The King's buff was such a strong buff in every iteration, in every expansion prior to it being changed, even when it got removed and when it was brought back. I think we're just such a strong buff that having it only on one class kind of pigeonholed you into bringing that class. And not to say that Paladin was a bad class. Like, I think in almost every aspect, like Wrath, BC, and Vanilla, Paladins were really good. If not for their performance of the spec, for the buffs that they brought. And you had to bring more than one because Paladins has some pretty important buffs, right? So I think more distribution on Kings, which is arguably the strongest of the buffs that they bring, is warranted. That being said, moving to where it went, so Mark of the Wild I think works just because on some of the changes to buffs and debuffs they did, Druids got certain things, they lost certain things, so giving this to Mark of the Wild makes sense to me. And giving it to Embrace the Shell Spider, so I'm not going to even sugarcoat this. I have a love-hate relationship with some of the buffs that the Hunter Pets provide. As you're going to see when we go through the list, Hunter Pets, spoiler alert, but Hunter Pets are pretty much a Swiss Army knife of buffs. And I think it works in some areas, and I think it shouldn't be the case in other areas. But in this case, I think it's okay. It comes from a Shell Spider, which you have to be a BM hunter to tame, because BM gets a talent called Exotic Beast Taming, and only they can tame certain pets. So I guess that's okay. Moving on down, we have the Strength and Agility buff. This is provided still by the Strength of Earth Totem from Shamans and the Horn of Winter from Death Knights. The new additions here are the Roar of Courage from the Cat family pets and Battle Shout. So Battle Shout has been changed. It no longer provides the static attack power. Now it provides Strength and Agility, and I think that's a welcome change. I mean, it's Battle Shout, right? It kind of is the same thing, right? It's just a different form of attack power, if you want to look at it that way. So I don't think that's a bad change. I don't know if this buff needed more distribution. I think Death Knights and to a lesser extent Shamans were pretty popular in and of themselves, that you could have warranted not changing Battle Shout and not giving the Hunter Pet it. But again, it's not a bad buff, right? It doesn't make or break anything, so having a little bit more distribution doesn't hurt in my opinion. Moving on down, we have the attack power buff. This is the percent buff, so again, no longer a static buff. So here we have Abomination's Might, Unleash Rage, and True Shot still providing it. You notice that now it is a 20% attack power increase for melee and a 10% for range. They split that, which is kind of weird because as we go along these buffs and debuffs, you're going to notice that they kind of merged a lot of things. This is one of the ones that come to my immediate mind that they split, and I don't really have a working theory on why they did that. They could have just made it like 15% attack power for everyone, but I'm guessing maybe it's because specifically for hunters they use ranged attack power, and they maybe weren't getting the full benefit from the Abomination's Might, Unleash Rage, and True Shot prior. So that could be, maybe that's my new working theory, is that hunters weren't fully benefiting from it. They had to differentiate melee and ranged, but it's just weird that this is one of the only ones that they split. And then we have the newcomer Blessing of Might, no longer giving the static attack power, now is the percent buff, and it also gives MP5. So I'm also gonna say one thing about it, and we're gonna get there eventually, but MP5 is no longer on gear anymore, and Blessing of Wisdom no longer exists. Neither does Divine Spirit for that matter. So they kind of just reworked how mana regen works, and what they did in Kata was they took Spirit and they just made it good for all healers, right? So in Wrath how really priests and druids are really the only ones who care about Spirit. The other casters don't really use it. They use MP5, and that's because they don't have a meditation style talent where they gain mana even while casting. Like druids are instant casters, so they really have the full benefit of Spirit, and priests have a meditation buff, or talent that is. But now Spirit is just the baseline regen for all healers, and I think that works. I think that's a good change, because if you're new to Wrath Classic, or not Wrath Classic, but if you're new to WoW Classic and you see mana per second and you see Spirit, you might not know what to do. It might be a little confusing before you start doing some research, but I like the Spirit change. It's kind of weird that they streamline Spirit for all healers and then they remove the Spirit buff and the MP5 buff. Kind of weird to me. But I guess they didn't technically remove it. They just got rid of Blessing of Wisdom. But kind of weird. But moving on, I think there really wasn't anywhere else to put the MP5 buff. I mean, they could have attached it to the King's buff, but that might have been weird. But then again, it's kind of weird putting it on Blessing of Might too. So I don't know what Blizzard was thinking. But all in all, that's the 20% and 10% attack power. Next, we have the attack speed buff, still brought by Wind Fury Totem and improved Icy Talons. And we have the new addition of Hunting Party. This comes from Survival Hunter specifically, not a pet though. This is actually the hunter. You have to be spec'd into Survival to get and provide the Hunting Party buff. And like I said before, I think Death Knights and Shamans were pretty popular, that they may not have needed to add another class on this buff, but this was a pretty sought after buff, and giving it to Survival I'm not mad at. So there you have that. Not too much of a long-winded explanation on that. But next we have the big one. We have Heroism / Bloodlust, famously or maybe infamously brought by Shamans. Now we have the addition of Time Warp and Ancient Hysteria. So Time Warp is brought by mages of any spec, meaning it's baseline. Doesn't matter if you play Arcane Fire or Frost, you can bring it. And Ancient Hysteria is caused by the Core Hound pet, which you got to be BM4 to use or to tame. And this is where I would say, or where I would start drawing the line on what buffs pets bring. And the only saving throw I'll give hunters getting the Ancient Hysteria buff via pets is in 10-man, at least currently, I see like a lot of 10-mans looking for, fills, and part of their advertisement would be, all right, doing 10-man Old War, need a shaman. And they need a shaman because of heroism, right? Need a shaman of any spec. They need it for heroism or bloodlust. So I can understand they wanting a wider distribution for 10-man, because 10-man did become more popular, in my opinion, in Cataclysm than it was in Wrath. Like, you see a lot of mainstay 10-man guilds. So I can understand that, but again, I feel like they would have been just fine with just adding mages to it and not giving such a powerful buff to core hounds, right? Because I feel like if you were just gonna do that, you might as well just make it a baseline thing, like kind of how mages just get time warp. Just give it to a pet that doesn't require exotic beast taming. Maybe that would have been too much, but I wouldn't have given the hunter pet Ancient Hysteria. I would have just kept time warp on mages. Mages are pretty popular, in my opinion. They're probably the second most popular range class behind hunters. So I think they would have been fine with just time warp and bloodlust, but hey, Blizzard did what they had to do. Moving on, we have the 5% crit buff. So I want to say this. So this is another one where they kind of remove something. So there's no longer a 5% spell crit buff. So the Moonkin aura does something different now. We're going to get to that in a second. But 5% crit is just crit. So it's crit across the board, whether you're a melee user or a spellcaster. And I mean, whether that's a welcome change or not, I mean, I think it streamlines it for sure. And because crit is a powerful buff, I think it just only helps. So here we have it being provided by Leader of the Pack and Rampage still, and Elemental Ult still. Yep, Elemental Ult just no longer provides spell crit, it's just all crit now. And then the new additions is Honor Among Thieves via Subtlety Rogues, and the Terrifying Roar via Devil Swords and Wolves with Furious Howl. And sub rogues getting it. Rogues and mages to a lesser extent, in my opinion, kinda don't get the shine for providing raid buffs, so I'm not mad at rogues getting this. Same thing with the Terrifying Roar and the Furious Howl. I think it's a decent enough buff that you could have a Hunter Pet provided without breaking anything. So I think keeping it on the Druids and the Fury Warriors works, and the Shamans, it works. And adding it to Rogues and Hunter Pets, I think still is an optimal choice. Moving on down, we have the 3% damage buff. So these are pretty much all the same sources that they are in Wrath, right? Arcane Mage via Arcane Tactics, Ferocious Inspiration from BM Hunters, and Communion from Ret Paladin. So the Ret Paladin one is the only slight change where it's not tied to an aura, it's tied to their replenishment. So when you judge and you proc the replenishment buff, you also give the 3% damage buff, but it still comes from Ret Paladin. So the source is still the same, changed ever so slightly. Moving on down, we have the Spell Haste buff. So this was, famously provided only by Shamans via Wrath of Air Totem, but now has two more sources coming from Shadow Form from Shadow Priest and Moonkin Form from Boomkins. So this is what I was saying before, that spell crit no longer exists. Instead, now they give Spell Haste, which I'm happy for, because Balanced Druids lost their spell crit buff. So I think replacing it with an equally desirable, maybe even more desirable buff kind of works, and giving Shadow Form or Shadow Priests the Spell Haste buff makes them much more utility friendly when building a group. So I'm not mad at these two sources, and I'm happy it stayed with Wrath of Air. I'm glad they didn't change it. Moving on down, we have the 10% spell power buff coming from Demonic Pact and Totemic Wrath. So these two definitely have gotten some changes. Number one, for Demonic Pact, this no longer scales off of the Demolock spell power. So you don't get a portion of the Warlock's spell power as your own spell power anymore. Now it's just a flat 10% spell power, no matter what gear the Warlock has, no matter what gear the Warlock doesn't have. It's just a flat 10% spell power. And for Totemic Wrath, it's no longer tied to Totem of Wrath. Now, whenever you drop any fire totem and you take the Totemic Wrath talent, it will just give you 10% spell power, which is pretty good, because the slight dilemma before was when you dropped Fire Elemental as an Elemental Shaman, you lost the Totem of Wrath buff. You had to wait until Fire Elemental was done before you could redrop it. Now, whenever you drop Fire Elemental, it's just going to, any Fire Totem for that matter, it's just going to give the Totemic Wrath buff. Kind of makes Flame Tongue useless, but at the same time, it's still a stronger version of Flame Tongue. And as far as the change from Demonic Pact, depending on how you feel about the support lock, I know a lot of people really, really like, playing support lock, having a support lock in the raid group. So this might be one of those unwelcome changes, but I don't really have a horse in that race. I don't really care. I think 10% spell power is fine, because it's still scaling off your own spell power. The more gear you get, the more effective this buff is going to be. So I'm not mad at it, but I can understand if you are a demo lock and you've been fed gear and you're doing all the supporty stuff and you're taking all the support talents, having that taken away from you may be a little bit of a bittersweet moment. Moving on down, we have the spell power buff coming from the Flame Tongue Totem and Arcane Brilliance. And I do want to say, first things first, that this 6% spell power buff does not stack with the 10%. So if you have Demonic Pact and Totemic Wrath, they will override these two buffs. When it comes to Arcane Brilliance, however, you notice that it no longer provides intellect. Now it just increases your maximum mana and provides the spell power buff. And the maximum mana buff doesn't get overridden by other spell power buffs. I want to say that you keep that. And I think removing the intellect isn't really that big a deal, because number one, people really only cared about the intellect buff for the increase in their mana pool anyway. So you're still getting that aspect, which I think is the bigger benefit. And because spell crit scaled so poorly with intellect, you're not really losing too much. So I'm not mad at removing the intellect aspect from Arcane Brilliance. So I think this is an okay buff. Next, we have increased mana coming from Arcane Brilliance, as we spoke about, and Fell Intelligence coming from the Fell Hunter pet from Warlocks. And these two pretty much are basically the same sources, right? Because the Fell Intelligence once was Intellect and Spirit. Of course, I said before, Spirit is no longer a buff, so they took that part out. And Intellect kind of isn't a buff now, it's just increased mana. So the sources are still the same, just worded and provided differently. And last on this list, we have the stamina buff provided famously from Power Word Fortitude by Priest, and the new Commanding Shout and Blood pack. So these no longer increase your maximum health. Now they actually increase your stamina, and of course it scales with things like, you know, kings and the stamina on your gear and so on and so forth. So this is a welcome change. And then the last thing on that list is the Karaji Fortitude. This is a hunter pet buff, and I gotta say, they probably could have left that one out. I think priests are pretty widespread enough to where you're getting this fortitude buff. And I'll even say, you know, maybe the blood pact one and the Karaji Fortitude kind of are the same thing, where it's like you don't really need those. Like those are like the last resort in my opinion. But it's a great change for changing maximum health to pure stamina. That's a good change. The Karaji Fortitude they could have left off. Blood pack was meh at best, and Commanding Shot I think was a welcome change, and Fortitude is the same. So there you have it with the raid buffs. Now let's move on to the single player buffs. So first on this list is Focus Magic. This coming from Arcane Mages, increasing the target's chance to critically hit by 3%, and when they get a critical hit, it increases the mage's critical hit chance by 3%. So this is the same Focus Magic that you know and love. I do want to note with changes they did to talents, which kind of ties into Focus Magic. So in Cataclysm, whenever you spec into a specialization, so if in this case Arcane, you can't deviate from that spec until you complete that tree, and I'll demonstrate that on a talent tree here in a second here. So here we have a talent calculator for Cataclysm for all of the classes, and like I said before, I will be bringing up the mage to show you kind of how they change the talent trees and so on and so forth. So here we have Arcane. So as you can see, they show you the benefits of what you get when you pick Arcane, and now that I've picked the tree, I can't put points in the fire tree or the frost tree until I complete the Arcane tree. So I have to get to Arcane power and select it before they let me deviate into the other subspecs. So let's just work our way down here. And what this really means is that you can't, like, you know, customize to your own specific, you know, blueprint of how you want to build yourself. But it also means that certain unique things like Focus Magic, which I just took here, are really only tied to Arcane Mages. Like, you can't be a Fire Mage, get all the way down to Living Bomb, and have enough points to get down to Focus Magic. And depending on how you look at it, you can look at it as a gift and a curse. So the gift would be Arcane has their own specific unique buff that they bring, kind of like how a Blood Decay brings Unholy Frenzy. But the other side is you can't really customize yourself to be any spec of mage and still provide a pretty powerful buff. So just depending on how you look at it will skew your viewpoint one way or the other. But I think this talent point or talent tree change, in my opinion, kind of what set off the homogenization, there we go, of classes, because now for the most part every single Arcane Mage is going to be the same. Sure, there's going to be some deviation, sure you may take, you know, one talent here over the other, but 99.9% of, you know, the mages are going to be running the same exact builds from the same exact spec. And I think that is like one of the starts of the downfall of original Cata, or maybe not downfall, but why it was a little bit less popular because of that change. But back to the buffs. Focus magic, yep, arcane only now, and it's deep arcane, so you cannot get it while being a fire or a frost mage. Moving on down, we have Unholy Frenzy. This comes from Blood Decay, and this got a little bit of a change too. So it no longer increases your physical damage by 20%. Now it increases your melee and ranged haste by 20%. So it's kind of like the physical version of Power Infusion. And this is a really welcome change in my opinion, because now you don't really got to think about who you can give this buff to, right? Now it's not just strictly bis for, feral DPS and combat rogues and frost DKs and warriors. Now you can kind of put it on any physical DPS and they're gonna make use of it because haste is great. So this is a really welcome change in my opinion. Tricks, it's the same thing. You know it, you love it. It comes from rogues. It's great for snapshotting. It's the same tricks, And Power Infusion is the exact same Power Infusion that you know and love, coming from the Disc Priest. And again, still powerful external. Gotta love it. Moving on down, we have the raid damage reduction. And the first on the list is probably the granddaddy of them all, the Divine Guardian, coming from the Protection Paladin. And in the same vein as Focus Magic, Divine Guardian is now too deep into the prot tree for Holy or Ret to make use of it. And again, you can look at that as a gift and a curse, because now you can say, great, Protection Paladins have their own unique utility that they can bring. But on the flip, you can say Holy and Ret lost something and lost a pretty powerful raid utility buff. So depending on how you look at it is your own choice, but Divine Guardian is still the same powerful damage reduction tool for the raid it's been. Next, we have Power Word Barrier. This is a new talent in the Discipline tree. It's the capstone talent. And what it does is puts a stationary large bubble on the ground. And while you're under it, you take 25% reduced damage and you resist all spell pushback while casting. And let me tell you that this buff, or this ability I should say, is extremely powerful. So powerful in fact that when Kata was out and the hardcore guilds were raiding, number one, this is actually a changed version. The original version of Powered Barrier reduced damage taken by 30%, not 25%. So this is the nerf version, which is more than likely what we will get. But it was so strong that it allowed you just to pretty much ignore healer checks, because everyone in the raid would just take 25% less from the large hitting ability. And if you don't know anything about Kata, do note that they love their raid-wide damaging effects. Nefarians, not Deathwing, not yet, but Nefarians, Crackle is probably one of the more famous ones. A large amount of nature damage is done to the raid that can just be reduced by 25% if you stand on a Powered Barrier. Halfist the Wormbreaker is another one that does a large amount of raid damage that can just be flat out reduced by 25%. So there's a lot of just damage that Powered Barrier can just soak up, and it's a very, very strong ability, and chances are you will see this a lot either in your guild or in your pug runs. And last on this list we have Spirit Link Totem, another newcomer coming in the Resto Shaman. So this is from Resto Shaman, and it reduces damage taken by 10%, so not as strong as Divine Guardian or Powered Barrier on the DR front, but the rest of the tooltip, every 1 second, the health of all affected players is redistributed evenly. So what this means is if you have somebody who is at 10% health and you yourself are at 90% health, when you drop Spirit Link Totem, your health will equalize. So that person will go up to 50, you will come down to 50. And it will continually redistribute and equalize the health of everyone standing in it, even while you're healing it, because it's not something that needs to be channeled. You just place it and you continue healing. And Spirit Link Totem is another really powerful ability, another ability that can kind of allow you to negate certain healer checks coming with raid damage incoming, right? So Spirit Link Totem and Powered Barrier are two things you're definitely going to see. They're very powerful. And I think they're welcome additions, because Divine Guardian just ruled the roost when it came to reducing raid damage, and having 5 paladins in your raid group kind of didn't always feel great. Now you have other options, so I'm glad they added these two things. And that's really it for the raid damage reduction. Now we're going to go on to the debuff side of things, starting with the offensive debuffs. Alright, so starting with the offensive debuffs, let's start at the top here with the 30% bleed debuff coming from Mangle and Blood Frenzy respectively. Those are still in the game. The newcomer is the Hemorrhage coming from the Subtlety Rogue, and Stampede, which is in the game. They just added more pets to provide this debuff, so Tendon, Rip, and Gore have been added. And this debuff was always kind of like the lackluster debuff, like, because really only Feral Druids care about their bleed damage. I'm not saying Deep Wounds isn't a good thing. I'm not saying, you know, Rupture isn't a good thing, but they weren't really known for their high sources of damage, at least not in Wrath. In Kata, it's probably a different story with Mastery and, you know, scaling and all that stuff, but this was like one of the weaker debuffs. But that being said, I mean, all of these sources are pretty much the same, except for Hemorrhage, which doesn't put on its own unique stacking dot. Now it just increases bleed effects. So I'm not mad at any of that change for Hemo, and I'm not, you know, there's no real thing to talk about here. It's just the same sources for the same debuff. Next, we have the 4% physical debuff. This is a pretty sought after buff, and we're going to talk about all the sources and what I think about it. So first is Savage Combat, which comes from Combat Rogues, Brittle Bones, which comes from Frost DK, and the Blood Frenzy still comes from Arms Warrior, and Acid Spit / Ravage comes from the Hunter Pets, because reasons. So because Arms really just doesn't perform well in Wrath, the 4% debuff really is only provided by the Combat Rogue. And not that Combat is bad. Combat is actually a pretty decent spec, and it's, you know, a lot better than Arms, but you're solely reliant on that Combat Rogue to provide that buff if you just don't want to have, you know, the support warrior and just have the Arms Warrior do this and provide your shattering throws and all that stuff. Like, you could have the support warrior, or you could have a class that actually is doing some damage and still providing some good utility. So that's why I think them adding more distribution to this debuff works, and I think it really worked on putting it on the Frost DK, because number one, Death Knights are popular. Number two, Frost is actually a pretty decent spec, so you're not really losing anything. And not to say that Encounter Warrior is bad, but Warrior is always on that pendulum of, in the beginning they're kind of lackluster, in the end they're great. So Death Knights and Rogues to a lesser extent don't really have that issue. So I'm kind of glad that they put it on Frost DK, because now you can really have options to get this and really have a consistent source of this debuff. I mean, the Hunter Pet, I mean, like I said, they're Swiss Army knife, right? So there you have that. Next, we have the Spell Crit debuff. This comes from Critical Mass via Fire Mages and Shadow and Flame from the Warlock Destro specifically. And I do want to say, at least with Critical Mass, first and foremost, these two sources are pretty much the same. Critical Mass is basically a new version of Improved Scorch, and Shadow and Flame is a new version of Improved Shadow Bolt. Now, Critical Mass is deep in the fire tree, so you can't be an Arcane Mage or a Frost Mage and still provide this buff. You have to be fire. But Shadow and Flame is like right at the top of the Destro tree, so you could be really any spec of Warlock and still provide this debuff. The sources, like I said, are still the same, so it doesn't really change anything there. The only thing is you have to be a Fire Mage to provide Critical Mass, and I mean, they did that with Arcane, right? You have to be Arcane to provide Focus Magic, so I guess this is just Fire Mage's way of providing their own unique utility, which I'm not mad at. Next, we have the 8% spell damage taken debuff. This famously comes from the Ebon Plaguebringer, Earth and Moon, and the Curse of Elements from Death Knights, Balanced Druids, and Warlocks respectively. The new addition is the Master Poisoner from Assassination Rogues, which I think is a welcome change, and the Fire Breath / Lightning Breath from the Hunter Pet, because reasons. So the Master Poisoner, I'm not mad at, because now each rogue spec kind of has its thing, right? Combat brings the 4% physical, Assassination brings the 8% magic, Sub brings the bleed debuff and the 5% crit. And I think that's a good spread, right? I think that's a good way to spread a pure DPS class and give them unique utility within each spec. So I'm not mad at that. Also, this gives more ways to spread this debuff, because as you know, if you're an Unholy Death Knight, all you gotta do is hit Pestilence and everything in range gets Ebon Plaguebringer. And I do know of a talent in the affliction tree that causes Curse of Elements to have a small AoE effect. So I believe it's called Jinx, and Editor Soul is going to take care of it and he's going to put it on the screen for me, but I'm pretty sure it's called Jinx. And it just like I said, it pretty much puts Curse of Element on a small AoE, and of course Master Poisoner can be spread via Fan of Knives, so I like it. Moving on down in the reduction debuffs, we have the 12% armor. So here we have Sunder Armor, Fairy Fire, Expose Armor, and Corrosive Spit / Tear Armor. And you'll notice that Sunder Armor now only stacks to 3, which I think is a pretty good change, because 5 Sunders, if you're a DPS warrior, kind of feels like forever in the beginning of a fight, right? Especially if your raid group is lusting in the beginning and your trinkets are proccing in the beginning. You want to spend more time actually doing your damage rotation, not building up a debuff. And one change you'll notice is that Sunder Armor and Fairy Fire are now 2 different debuffs, so they no longer they're 2 of the same debuff, so they no longer stack. They're no longer different debuffs. So I guess if you have a druid in the group, you don't even have to worry about Sunder, which I think will make all warriors happy. As far as Exposed Armor and Corrosive Spit, I mean, I truly don't understand why Exposed Armor is a thing. I mean, I know why it's a thing. It's for smaller groups. If you don't have a warrior, if you don't have a druid, the rogue can still provide this buff. But spending combo points on this just seems like a horrific endeavor, and I feel for the rogue if they got to do that. And of course, Corrosive Spit is the hunter pet equivalent because reasons. Moving on down, we have the attack speed slow. All of these sources are the same in Wrath as they are in Kata, except for the new addition of Tailspin. You already know what that is, though I gotta tell you it's a hunter pet. But Thunderclap, Icy Touch, Judgment of the Just, and Infected Wounds all provide this. They're all the same sources in Wrath as they are in Kata, so there you have it. Lastly, we have the attack power, or in this case, physical damage reduction. So we have Demo Shout and Demo Roar, still mainstays. Vindication is still a mainstay. And then we have the new addition of Scarlet Fever. So this is in the blood tree of Death Knight. And this is a talent that you don't have to take if you have a consistent source of this debuff. You don't have to. In my opinion, I think you should, just because you're probably going to be doing other things, whether you know, if your main group is a 25-man group, you're probably still going to run a 10-man group. You're probably still going to do dungeons. So just having as much debuffs covered as you possibly can, I think works, especially if you're in a tanking role. But yeah, Scarlet Fever is just the Death Knight version of like Vindication. So, which has moved to the prop tree. Vindication is now in the prop tree, not in the red tree. Just to note that. But yeah, I think adding Scarlet Fever just makes sense because Blood is the now bona fide tank. Blood is now the tank. I should actually mention that somewhere, but yeah, Frost and Unholy are strictly DPS specs. Blood is now the de facto tanking spec for Death Knight. So if you want to tank as a Death Knight, you gotta be Blood. And that's it for the reduction debuffs. Now we're gonna start talking about resource returns. All right, now we're in resource return, and at the top of this list we have the replenishment effects coming from Vamp Touch, Revitalize, Soul Leech, Enduring Winter, and Communion. And the 2 major changes here is really Revitalize and Enduring Winter. Enduring Winter is only in the Frost tree now. You can't have it any other way, and that's just kind of the mainstay of Kata. Each spec now has their own thing. Fire has Critical Mass, Arcane has the Arcane Tactics and Focus Magic, and now Frost Mage has Enduring Winter for mana regen. And the Revitalize change is probably the biggest change because it no longer provides those combat resources. It no longer provides energy, runic power, rage, or whatever else have you. It just provides mana now. It's just a replenishment effect. And I think that's a sad change. I think that's a sad change for the resto spec of Druid, because Revitalize may not have been a game-defining make or break play, but it was still pretty unique, especially in the fact that it gave energy, so it was really high value for energy users. And there wasn't really anything like it in the game. Like, there wasn't a buff that you got from another class, or not a buff, but a resource return that you got from another class that gave you actual meaningful resources outside of mana. So even though it might have been necessary to combat power creep, it's still pretty sad in my opinion to see it go. So, but that's really it for replenishment. All of these sources with the addition of Revitalize are pretty much the same. Next, we have the mana restoration coming from Mana Spring Totem, Fell Intelligence, and Blessing of Might. Again, Blessing of Wisdom is no longer a thing. Divine Spirit is no longer a thing. So these are the only ways to get MP5 via raid buffs. And we talked about Blessing of Might and Fell Intelligence. We kind of talked about too. And Mana Spring Totem, you already know what that does. So pretty much all these are the same. Next, we have the Mana Tide Totem. And this one pretty much is unchanged too. It's only provided by the Resto Shaman, which I'm glad they didn't really add anything. I think this should be unique to the Resto Shaman. So I'm glad that this didn't see too much change here, and it pretty much does what you think it does. They drop it down, and the raid members regenerate 200% of the Shaman Spirit. So it's a little bit different. It's no longer a portion of your own mana. It's 200% of the Shaman Spirit. Next, we have Hymn of Hope, which pretty much is the same thing as what you know it to be. It restores 2% mana to 3 near and low by targets and increases your maximum mana for a little bit. And yeah, there's not too much to say about Hymn of Hope. Most of these mana resource, or I guess resource return, are pretty much the same. And that doesn't change for this or Innervate. It's literally the same thing. So that's really it for the resource return. Nothing really to talk about too much there. Next, we have the health return. Here we have Divine Hymn, which is exactly the same as it is in Wrath. So I'm not going to talk about it too much. And Vampiric Embrace is exactly the same that it is in Wrath. So there's nothing really to talk about there. One thing I do want to note that's missing from this health return is Tranquility. So Tranquility does the exact same thing as Divine Hymn now. It doesn't just heal the party anymore. Now it heals the entire raid group, well, 3 lowest members in the raid group, for a specific amount. And actually, I'm going to jump to a different page here so I can show you the changes that they did to Tranquility. So note here we have the patch note changes for Tranquility. We're really going to be looking at the Cata versions. So Tranquility in 4.0.1, which I believe is the pre-patch, or it might just be the actual patch in Cata. Change to raid-wide and effect rework to be similar to Divine Hymn, now learned at level 68. Tranquility is now properly scaled when used by a Tree of Life form. And the last change they did is Druid now innately have 100% spell pushback protection while channeling Tranquility. So when when Cataclysm does come out, we will get the most up-to-date version of Tranquility. So all of these effects will be in when we release Wrath Classic. It's kind of like how they did TBC in Wrath, where we're starting at the end of the patch cycle, so they don't have to go through and pre-patch anything. So that's the same thing for Tranquility. And also, I forgot to read, Malfurion's Gift now reduces the cooldown of Tranquility by 2.5/5 minutes, depending on how many talent points you put in. And yeah, I don't know why Tranquility isn't on the list of health return, but it effectively is the same thing as Divine Hymn. The only thing it doesn't do, it doesn't increase your healing received by 10% like Divine Hymn does. It instead just puts a hot on you, which it ties into how the druids play. So yeah, Tranquility should have been added to that little list there. While we're speaking on things that shouldn't have or should have been on this list that aren't for some reason, under the single player buffs, Dark Intent should have been on here. So Dark Intent, and also I'm going to put it up on the screen, but Dark Intent is a warlock only ability. It's baseline for all warlocks, and it's a single player buff where when you put it on someone, it increases their periodic damage by 1%, my apologies, stacking every time they get a periodic effect. And when they get a periodic effect, the warlock's periodic damage and healing is increased by 3% stacking. And it's kind of like the warlock's version of focus magic, except it doesn't increase your crit. It increases periodic damage and healing for the person and increases haste for the warlock. So I don't know why it's not up here in the single player buffs, but it should be. Kind of like the same thing for Tranquility, should be in health return, but there it is, no harm, no foul. But lastly and finally on this list, we have the utility abilities. We have Smoke Bomb from rogues, and this is baseline for all rogues. And it says a cloud of smoke interferes with targeting. Basically what this means is the smoke creates line of sight. So if everyone is stacked up on top of each other and the rogue drops a smoke bomb, anything targeting you at range now has to move into the smoke bomb to actually hit you. They cannot hit you from outside the smoke bomb. So it's a really good zoning tool. It's a really good LOS tool if you try to bring, you know, casters or ranged mobs in. It's a pretty good ability to have. Do note that this version of smoke bomb does not reduce your damage taken by 10% while in it. That is a later iteration in MOP, I believe. So that's not this smoke bomb. This is just an LOS stopping thing. And then lastly, we have Stampeding Roar coming from Druids, which increases your movement speed by 60%. And this, to me, is a really, really good utility ability. As you're going to see in a lot of the why do I keep saying Wrath? Ugh, get out of my head. A lot of the Cata raids, burst movement is going to be important for certain mechanics. And I can think of a number of fights, especially like in the Firelands tier, that all but require you to have a Stampeding Roar, because movement is always something that you shouldn't slack on. So Stampeding Roar is a really good ability. And that's really it for the list. Note here, the last time I did this kind of video, I did a video on basically the ideal comps for Wrath 10 and 25, and I didn't really do that here. Maybe I will later, but I really just want to go over the changes to the different buffs and debuffs and just kind of give my opinions on said changes and what I think was strong, what I think was weak, what I think didn't need to happen, what I think did need to happen. So I'm glad I got a chance to sit down and share this with you all. But that's it for the video, guys. Like and subscribe if you want to see more content from me. And as always, you guys have been great. I've been Soul, and I'm out. Peace.